Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this video we're going to take a look at lambdas with receivers. This is definitely getting quite complex and a little bit obscure. This is probably not something that you're going to want to use every day. And you're definitely going to want to practice this stuff because otherwise it will build up into a sort of gigantic rat's nest inside your head. But as long as you keep practicing, the stuff that we're seeing in each video does build upon the stuff that we've seen previously in some kind of a way. So even if you don't immediately start using this in your Kotlin programs, I think this will help you to understand how Kotlin works. Let's start by quickly revising extension functions and receivers. So I'm going to create a function here which I'll call greet. Let's say this takes no parameters and it returns unit. So in other words, it doesn't return anything. And I'm going to make this an extension function of the string class. So before the function name, I write string dot to say that this is to be called on strings. In other words, a string is the receiver of this function. In there, let's just write print line, and I'm going to output some text. Now, in an extension function, you can access the receiver object using this. So I could write hello $this. How would we use this function? Well, let's say we have a string with a name in it, for example. I can then call greet within this scope. So this will now access this string right here. This is a concrete instance of a string that we can access with this. And we're going to run this function, so we're going to see this greeting coming out. Let's run it. And there we see it says hello Bob. So the object that we call the function on is what we call the receiver. And as we've seen, this somewhat stems from the early days of object-oriented programming, when calling a method like this isn't actually a method, but it's kind of a similar idea. It's an extension function. Calling a method like this on an object was considered to be sending a message to the object. So the object therefore becomes the receiver, the thing that gets the message. In this case, it's the thing that we call the extension function on. And we have also previously seen that if you have a method reference, then you can also supply the receiver as the first parameter to that function. So let's create a method reference here. I'll call it greeting. I'll make it var greeting. And the type of this is going to be a function that has a receiver of string. So we put string dot. It has no parameters and it returns unit. And I can set that equal to string : greet. So when I called this function via this method reference or function reference, I have to supply the receiver object somehow. So I could write, for example, su.greeting, and that's perfectly valid, but I could also supply the receiver as the first parameter to this function. So I could say greeting and let's pass in Pete. All of these work perfectly well. Let's run it. And you can see that we've got hello Sue and hello Pete coming out down there. Another way to do it would be to directly use the function reference without storing it in a variable. So I could, for example, say string : greet. That's a reference to this extension function. And then I have to supply the receiver object somehow. And you might think you could do that by putting round brackets and putting in a name here. Let's put Rita. That actually doesn't work, but only because Kotlin's not quite sure how to interpret this. I get a message saying this syntax is reserved for future use. But all I have to do to make this work is just put brackets around the reference bit so that it's clear what's supposed to be happening here. And that also works. So here we've got hello Rita coming out. Now the question is, how do we work with receiver objects in the context of lambda expressions? So I should be able to point this greeting at a lambda expression. Even though it has a receiver, we can still do it. So let's write greeting equals, and I'll use a lambda expression. And in there, I'm going to do print line, and let's output a greeting. So I've used hello previously. Let's now use hi. And within a lambda, I can use this This always refers to, by default, whatever object exists at the enclosing scope. So in this case, when I use greeting, I have to supply a receiver object, and this will then refer to that receiver object. So for example, if I have a string like this, let's write Steve, I can then call greeting, and I'm supplying the receiver object that this requires, because I've said here it expects a receiver, and that allows me to make use of this as well. So I can supply the receiver object right here. We know this lambda expects a receiver because the variable that refers to it is of a type that expects a receiver object. If I run this, we're going to see hi Steve, and here it is. And an alternate way to do it would be to write greeting and supply the receiver object as the first parameter here. So if we run this, then we get 2 hi Steves coming out now. So that's all the code that we've got today. I appreciate that this is a little bit complicated, but as I say, if you practice it, if you try typing this stuff out yourself, you experiment with it a bit, it will gradually start to make sense, and it will give you more insight into how Kotlin works. And then when you see complicated looking expressions involving receivers in other people's code, you're not going to be so baffled by it. So that's it for this video, and until next time, happy coding.